The GPS said we had arrived, but instead of the bright skyline we had dreamed about for months, we were staring at a crooked wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek." My best friend, Marcy, slammed her hand on the steering wheel and burst out laughing, and I couldn't stop myself from laughing too, even though rain was pouring down so hard the windshield looked like it was melting. We were supposed to be pulling into a bustling city full of rooftop bars and museums, but instead we found ourselves in a tiny village with one blinking streetlight and a cat the color of rust watching us from the curb as if we were tonight's entertainment. Nothing about this trip had gone right since the morning we left. Her suitcase zipper broke, my phone charger died, and the hotel in the city canceled our reservation with a casual email that said, "Sorry, overbooked." We should have taken it as a sign. But no, we packed the car, trusted the GPS, and ended up here, in the kind of place we'd normally drive through without even slowing down. And that was when I spotted a little inn up the hill, its porch light glowing warm against the storm. A hand-painted sign said, "Rosewood House, rooms and dinner." I turned to Marcy and said, "Let's just stay one night. Tomorrow we'll figure it out." She sighed, then shrugged, and the cat trotted ahead of us like a guide. We didn't know it then, but that wrong turn was about to lead us to the best vacation we'd ever had. The porch creaked as we climbed the steps, and before we could knock, the door swung open to a woman in her late 60s with silver hair braided down her back and a dish towel over her shoulder. She took one look at our damp jackets and said, "You're right on time for supper." Like we were expected guests rather than two soggy strangers who had misplaced a city. Her name was Ruth, the innkeeper and cook and apparently local historian, and the lobbies smelled like cinnamon and old books, which felt like a hug after the day we'd had. "Cash is king," she warned with a smile, "but if you're short we'll settle up later. No one goes hungry in a storm," and she handed us each a key on a brass fob that had more weight than any hotel card I've ever used. We ate at a big farmhouse table with two traveling salesmen and a retired music teacher who told stories about marching bands and halftime shows while Ruth ladled out chicken and dumplings that tasted like someone had prayed over them. When the power flickered, no one panicked. Ruth just lit two oil lamps and said the lines out to the highway go temperamental when the creek rises. "Is that why the GPS lied?" I asked, and she chuckled. "It didn't lie, honey, it just doesn't know us as well as we know ourselves." After dinner, she showed us to a room with a quilt of tiny blue triangles and a window that looked out over dark trees. Somewhere down the hill a dog barked twice, and then all we could hear was the rain on the roof. Marcy stood at the window, phone held high like a torch, searching for a bar of service that never found her, and I lay on the bed and felt something unspool in my chest that I hadn't noticed was knotted. "One night," she said, and I said, "One night," and neither of us believed it. Morning came in soft and green, the storm scrubbed clean from the leaves, and Willow Creek looked like it had shaken itself awake and put on its best face. The cat from last night sat on the porch rail like a small mare. Our car did not share the town's optimism. The engine clicked, sighed, and gave up. Ruth called a mechanic named Earl who arrived in a truck the color of faded denim, listened to the engine with a mechanic's sixth sense, and said, "Alternator's on its way to the Lord. I can get you fixed up, but the part will be 2 days if the distributor's awake and 3 if he's fishing." Marcy's shoulders sagged, then squared. I could see the moment she chose not to be angry at the universe. "What does one do in Willow Creek for 2 or 3 days?" I asked, and Earl said, "Eat pie, walk slow, and try not to scare the herons," which turned out to be a perfect itinerary. We wandered to a small market where a woman sold jars of honey with labels she'd written by hand, and a boy with a gap-toothed grin offered us tomatoes that tasted like August even though the calendar insisted it was June. A flyer pinned to a corkboard announced Founders Day on Saturday with a parade, a pie contest, and a dance on the green. Marcy took a picture of it and said, "If we're stuck, we might as well be stuck with live music." At a pottery shed near the creek, an artist named Lewis waved us in to escape the sun and handed Marcy a hunk of clay, and in 10 minutes she had more joy on her face than I'd seen in months. Next door, a baker named Joe taught me to crimp a pie crust without pinching my fingers, and when I told her I'd only ever bought frozen, she put a hand over her heart like I'd confessed to a crime and said, "We'll fix that, sweetheart." We fell into the town the way you fall into step with an old song. By noon we knew where Earl took his lunch, and which bench had the best shade, and who made the lemonade with a pinch of salt that reminded Marcy of her grandmother. The retired music teacher from supper turned out to be named Alma, and she ran the volunteer committee for Founders Day with a voice like a metronome. She recruited us before we knew we'd agreed. "We need 2 more hands at the pie tent and someone to help the kids tie their parade ribbons," she said, tapping her clipboard, and Marcy raised her hand like a kid in homeroom while I said something non-committal that Alma interpreted as a yes. That afternoon Ruth pulled a recipe card from a tin and pressed it into my palm. It was soft at the corners and stained with butter, and across the top in tidy script it read "June berry pie," which made me like it on principle. "It was my mother's," she said, "hers before that, and it never loses." Then she winked, "But losing is good for the soul every once in a while." Marcy spent an hour at Lewis's while learning to coax a bowl out of a wobbling lump. Then we sat on the creek bank and watched a great blue heron lift itself out of the water, like an old gentleman standing from a chair. Marcy said, "We would have missed this," and I said, "We were so busy going somewhere we forgot to be anywhere." That night there was a community supper on the green because the power lines were sulking again. Everyone brought something and the tables groaned, and when the sky went lavender and the first bats skimmed low, a fiddler tuned up and you could feel shoulders drop all over the crowd. My phone buzzed twice in my pocket with the name of my boss and 3 more times with texts that said urgent, then question marks, then can you hop on a call, and for a moment the old panic rose. The one that says, "You are only as valuable as your answer time." I silenced it and slipped the phone face down under my thigh. Ruth handed me a plate and said, "You look like someone trying to carry water with a net," and I laughed because I was. I told her about the email that had ruined our morning yesterday, and the calls that were trying to ruin tonight, and the way my calendar had eaten my year. "Honey," she said, "if you don't leave a little room for the world to surprise you, it will do it anyway and make a mess." The fiddler slid into Tennessee Waltz as if he'd heard her, and a man about our age with a salt and pepper beard asked Marcy to dance. She hesitated, then handed me her lemonade and drifted onto the grass. Alma clapped in time, little kids ran in loops, and someone passed around a mason jar labeled for the school roof fund. When it reached me I put in a 10 and felt rich. Later, under strings of cafe lights, Joe showed me how to whisk sugar into berries until they glowed, and she said, "The trick is patience you don't think you have," which felt like a lesson about pie and everything else. I sent my boss a single text that read, "On vacation, back Monday," and when the 3 bouncing dots appeared, I turned the phone off and slipped it into the bottom of my bag like a stone I was tired of carrying. The next morning Earl called with news that sounded like a diagnosis delivered kindly. The alternator had arrived, but the belt that hugged it had snapped in his hands, dry-rotted and stubborn. "1 more day," he promised, "2 if luck refuses to be polite." And I surprised myself by saying, "Take the time you need." Marcy and I walked the old railroad path that had been scrubbed into a trail by a Boy Scout troop years back. Ferns brushed our calves, and the creek kept us company, chuckling over stones. And when we came to a clearing there was a little white church with paint peeling in charming strips and a bell that looked like it could still call a town to supper. We met a woman arranging wildflowers in jars on the steps. She introduced herself as Pastor Elaine and asked if we'd write a wish on a ribbon for the Founders Day tree. I wrote, "Let me remember this kind of quiet," and Marcy wrote, "Let me make things with my hands," and Pastor Elaine tied them up high where they would flutter even when we were gone. On the way back, we found a small farmer standing in his field staring at the sky with the same attention I give an email that might change everything. He said rain was due tonight, and it would either save his beans or drown them, and that there was very little in between. He said it with peace, not fear, and I wondered when I had last accepted what I couldn't control without trying to outwork it. That evening Ruth pulled an old radio onto the porch and tuned it until a baseball game came in thin and tinny. A few of us played checkers at the far table. Alma beat me twice with apparent kindness. And Marcy held up a lopsided bowl she'd thrown at Lewis's and said, "It's a start," which it was, and so were we. Founder's Day woke the town like a bell, and I woke before my alarm because the kitchen smelled like coffee and butter and good nerves. Jo was already there with flour on her elbows and a laugh that made the room wider. We rolled crusts until our wrists complained, crimped edges until mine started to look like hers, and filled pies until the counter looked like a field in June. At one point Jo said, "Stop while you still love it," which I filed away for Monday. Marcy took photos for the committee with a cheap disposable camera Ruth had in a drawer, and each time she clicked I could see her collecting proof that she could see beauty without a filter. The parade started at 10 with 3 tractors, 2 dogs in bandanas, a convertible carrying a woman who had turned 97 in April, and a group of kids carrying the Founder's Day banner like it weighed friendship. A boy lost a shoe and kept marching, and the whole town cheered like he'd scored a touchdown. At noon the pie tent opened and the line formed, and I forgot to be nervous. I sold slices and refilled napkins and wiped down the knife and listened to compliments land like small gifts, and when the judging ended I didn't win and neither did Jo. A quiet man named Carlos won with a peach pie that tasted like home, and he looked embarrassed by the attention. Jo hugged him first, and I loved her for it. In the afternoon dark clouds gathered and rolled, and then parted without malice, and the dance began at twilight with a local band whose drummer only knew one beat and made it count, just after 9. As the band slid into a slow song that made the older couples smile at each other with a history we could feel, my phone vibrated with a voicemail notification from my boss, because even turned off it kept score. I didn't listen. Instead, I watched Ruth sway with a tall man in a cap who had probably loved her for 50 years, and I watched Alma take a little girl by the hands and teach her 2 steps and a turn. And I watched Marcy dance with Louis, and then with an 80-year-old named Frank who insisted she was light as a feather, and she pretended to be offended. A little later Ruth sat beside me on the steps and asked if we had decided whether to head out in the morning. And I told her about the city plans that had evaporated and the museum tickets that would go unused, and how certain I had been that a perfect vacation could be built like a cabinet if you measured twice and cut once. "You can build a fine cabinet," she said, "but the best dinners I've ever eaten were made from what I had, not what I planned." She patted my knee and went to refill the lemonade, and I felt something click into place that had been rattling for years. When the last song ended, the band packed up carefully like men who knew how to treat a good thing. Folks said goodnight and meant it, and the green emptied slowly until only the lights and the tree with our wishes were left to flutter to themselves. Sunday morning Earl called to say the car was ready and we could make the city by lunch if we hurried. I looked at Marcy and she looked at me, and we both knew we weren't going anywhere fast. We took our time, said our goodbyes like people who believed in coming back, and paid Ruth for the room and dinner and 2 pies we had absolutely not earned but were taking anyway. She tried to refuse the extra we pressed into her hand for the school roof fund, then tucked it away with a nod that said she understood the pleasure of giving. On the porch steps the rust-colored cat rubbed against my shin and then sat with the calm of a creature who trusts the sun. At the edge of town we stopped at the church to see our ribbons move in the breeze and found Pastor Elaine watering the small patch of flowers by the steps. She said, "Detours are where most prayers get answered." And I laughed because it sounded like a line from a book I should have read a decade ago. We drove out past fields and a piece of creek that flashed like silk, and when the highway signs started to look familiar the GPS announced we would reach the city in 2 hours, and I turned it off because I didn't need it to tell me where I'd been. Back home the week picked up its old habits and tried to put them on me. My boss asked why I had been hard to reach, and I said the truth out loud for the first time in a long time, that I had been busy being a person who doesn't live at her desk, and the silence that followed was short and survivable. Marcy picked up a second-hand wheel from a listing and began throwing bowls that were less lopsided every evening. She started sleeping the kind of sleep you earn with your hands. I baked Jo's pie at least 3 times that month, and once for my mother, who cried into her fork and said it tasted like the summer after her father came home from the war, and if that isn't a win, I don't know what is. We mailed a stack of prints from Marcy's disposable camera to Ruth along with a letter that said thank you in a dozen ways, and a week later a package arrived with a small framed map of Willow Creek that Earl had drawn himself in careful pen. And on the back Ruth had written, for when you forget how to get here. The city we didn't visit was still there, waiting politely for the next time we booked and measured and cut, and so was the town we hadn't planned to love. Both of them were real. Both of them had lessons to give, and one of them had found us when we needed it. Months later, we drove back on purpose, not because the GPS insisted, and when the sign for Willow Creek swung into view, we both laughed, the kind of laugh that feels like standing in a kitchen warmed by an oven. Ruth met us on the porch like we had only stepped out for a moment, and Alma put us to work without ceremony, rolling napkins for the autumn supper, and Joe handed me a bowl of apples and a peeler and said, "Don't cut yourself while you remember things." And I didn't. At dusk, the heron lifted itself from the creek, as if to mark attendance, and the Founder's Day ribbons now hung faded in the church entryway like proof that wishes do not have to be loud to be heard. We sat on the steps after supper and counted 3 satellites crawling across the sky and decided that if we had made it to the city that first night, we would have had a good time and some excellent photos, and it would have been fine. And we would have missed the exact world that had taught us how to be satisfied and surprised at once. Marcy took my hand for a second and squeezed, the way people who have walked through something together sometimes do without planning, and I remembered Ruth saying money is noise and people are quiet, and thought she might be onto something bigger than supper at 6. Looking back, I realized that missing the city was the best thing that could have happened to us. Every plan we made fell apart, and yet somehow that opened the door to something better, a place that taught us to slow down, to listen, and to find joy in what was right in front of us. I used to believe that if things didn't go according to plan, it meant failure. Now I know it can mean freedom. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had something go completely wrong, only to discover it was exactly what you needed?